Explosions continued to shake the Gaza Strip overnight amid confusion over the Israeli army's tactics. A tweet published by the Israeli Defense Forces said air and ground troops were currently attacking the Hamas-run enclave, but hours later it clarified soldiers had not entered Gaza, blaming an internal communication problem for the mix-up. Instead, the army said it was using artillery in response to a new barrage of rocket fire. In Gaza's Shajaya neighbourhood, air raids forced Palestinian families to flee en masse.
الضرب كتير الصغار كلها انصرعت خافت يعني احنا الكبار اللي شوف من يوم ما انولدت انا واحنا في الحرب صرنا خفنا يعني ما حدش قادر يتحمل هذا حاجه.
Red alert sirens sounded in several cities in southern Israel early Friday morning. There were reports of several wounded in rocket attacks in Ashkelon. Earlier on Thursday, residents of the city ran for cover as sirens warned of incoming fire.
אנחנו רגילים למצב הזה, עם ישראל חזק, תודה לקדוש ברוך הוא, תומכים אחד בשני, ובעזרת השם שהכל יעבור על שלום. לגמור עם זה פעם אחת לתמיד וזהו בעזרת השם.
On Thursday, the Israeli army said it was amassing troops and tanks along the Gaza border and had called on 9,000 reservists ahead of a possible ground invasion. Hamas responded by saying ground attacks would be a chance for the group to, quote, increase its catch of soldiers.
Shelling continues deep into the Gaza night as jet planes from the Israeli Defense Forces target the city. Their response to the rockets fired by Hamas, as the IDF claimed to have struck a significant blow to their weapon production sites.
Hamas made a serious mistake when they decided to fire at the state of Israel. The IDF responded with an attack, during which we are operating based on pre-prepared plans, and we have further stages ready to go.
Many Palestinians in Gaza have fled their homes. Thousands are taking shelter in the 16 UN-run schools, where they risk catching COVID in cramped conditions. Israel blames Hamas fighters mingling among civilians in the densely populated territory for the non-military deaths.
My brother was present with his wife and 4 children. There was no warning or anything. Then, 5 rockets. He destroyed them. His wife was pregnant. The IDF has no mercy, not for children, adults, young, old, or women. May God have mercy on them.
Israeli forces are deployed along Gaza's border. Early on Friday, the military said a ground incursion had begun, later retracting the claim. Some observers say this was a deliberate move to mislead Hamas militants. Meanwhile, the United Nations is calling for an immediate cessation to hostilities to protect civilian lives, as the Palestinian Health Ministry appeals for blood donations for the wounded. But Benjamin Netanyahu has indicated he's not willing to back down, stating, quote, "It's not over yet."
In the Associated Press, President says the agency is shocked and horrified after an Israeli airstrike destroyed a building in Gaza housing media outlets. Israel claims the building contained Hamas intelligence assets in an effort to ease tensions. US President Joe Biden has spoken to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Palestinian President urging calm.
Palestinian Authority has been encouraging people to protest, and that is what they are doing. And you can see they have, I think, through the course of the afternoon, been clashing with the Israeli military who passed through the security barrier put up by Israel. These clashes are pretty regular, but they're happening with more intensity, I think, at the moment. I was in Ramallah yesterday watching the same thing unfold, and we have seen the same again today. So in the West Bank, we are seeing an uprising of sorts by Palestinians, relatively peaceful, it must be said. You mentioned Joe Biden having spoken to President Mahmoud Abbas. He, to be clear, is the president of the Palestinian Authority, who have control of those parts of the West Bank that I just described, the large cities like Bethlehem, Jericho, Ramallah, and a few others, Hebron, Nablus, these sorts of places. The difference is that down in Gaza, a different organisation, Palestinian organisation, is in control, Hamas, and it is they that are firing the rockets at Israel. And that brings me to where I am now, which is a suburb of Tel Aviv. This is where this afternoon a Hamas rocket landed. About 1:30 in the afternoon, people just sitting down for their Shabbat, their Sabbath lunch, when the rocket hit. It caused one death, one fatality, a 50-year-old man who was sitting just around the corner. You can see probably just about make out the building behind me there. That is where he was sitting. He was killed by shrapnel. I think it has really affected the Israeli psyche, certainly the psyche of the Israeli government, that Hamas is continuing to be able to strike right in the heart of the largest city in Israel. I think for people here, that stirs something. That has really surprised them. Of course, what Israel is doing in Gaza is incomparable compared to the damage that those rockets the Hamas rockets cause here. Over the course of the past day, we've seen another heavy bombardment in Gaza. We were speaking to our own team who are there inside the strip. We can't get in ourselves at the moment because the Israelis have closed off the fence and not allowing any access. But inside the strip, we are seeing extraordinary levels of destruction.
Protesters have taken to the streets in the West Bank, marking the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people during the 1948 war following the creation of the Israeli state. It serves as a grim reminder of how far back this conflict goes. And Sky News' Deborah Haynes has this report for you now.
The siren cries out for 73 seconds. One for each year since what Palestinians call the catastrophe. Al-Nakba, May the 15th. The day after the State of Israel was born, and in the eyes of Palestinians, when their dreams died. It's an annual moment of grief and protest, with emotions particularly high this year.
Because of the Nakba today, things are going more complicated and stuff like that.
And will you keep on protesting?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we'll keep protesting until we're free.
In Ramallah on the West Bank, anger also expressed more forcefully. It triggers tear gas in return from Israeli soldiers.
طبعا عشان القدس، عشان غزة، عشان الشيخ جراح، عشان فلسطين.
This is Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem. A Jewish legal attempt to evict some Palestinians from the neighbourhood helped trigger the crisis. Diplomatic efforts are underway to halt the carnage, but this professor isn't optimistic.
I think it's very important to save lives immediately. However, I also realize from my former experience with what happened in the past that after this ends, probably nothing will change.
Back on the West Bank, fury burns.
Even if the leaders on both sides agree to some kind of ceasefire, however unlikely that might seem right now, it'll do nothing to cease the sense of suffering and rage felt by Palestinians across this region.
The path to a lasting peace, all but impossible to see. Deborah.
In a moment, with a phone call from the Israeli army, another Gaza high-rise became a condemned building, minutes ticking down on a 1-hour warning. This, the office of the Associated Press, as its staff made instant decisions about what they needed to salvage to keep on working. Across the lift lobby, staff from the Al Jazeera bureau were doing the very same thing. On the street outside, the building's owner pleading for a stay of execution.
We need 10 minutes. As you can see, they're all around me. The press, not people who are going in to get weapons out.
But there was no arguing, not even about the timing.
انهار البرج انهار البرج انهار البرج.
Al Jazeera Gaza journalist Safwat Al-Khalut was live on air as he watched his workplace of 11 years vanish in front of him.
We panicked, frankly, we panicked. How to leave, when to leave, what to take, where to go. These are like the quick and the fast things that you think of when something like that happens.
This building was home to families as well as media companies, more to add to the list of homeless in a besieged enclave during days of intensive attacks from the sky. In a statement, Al Jazeera said it condemned in the strongest terms the bombing and destruction of its offices by the Israeli military, viewing it as a clear act to stop journalists from conducting their duty to inform the world and report events, and vowing to pursue every available route to hold the Israeli government responsible. The Israeli military said Hamas operatives were using the building, and media companies like Al Jazeera and the Associated Press were human shields.
I want to remind the world that in firing on our cities, Hamas is committing a double war crime. They're targeting our civilians and hiding behind Palestinian civilians.
We've heard that from the Israelis. I can tell you that we've been in that building for about 15 years with our bureau. We certainly had no sense that Hamas was there. We would like to see the evidence. We're not sure whether Hamas was there or not. We don't know. But I can tell you the impact will be that the world will know less about what's going on in Gaza because that building was leveled.
Hamas's top Gaza political leader issued this message during a visit to the Qatari capital, Doha.
Look, this is the besieged Gaza that has been besieged for 15 years under siege from every direction.
Hamas's military wing sent further major rocket attacks deep into Israeli territory on Saturday. A 55-year-old Israeli man was killed when one rocket struck his home in a Tel Aviv suburb. In the midst of it all, in the occupied West Bank, Palestinian protesters confronted Israeli soldiers on Nakba Day, when Palestinians mark the creation of the State of Israel, what they call the catastrophe. The Palestinian Red Cross said scores were wounded, many by live ammunition. In occupied East Jerusalem, more scuffles around the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, where threatened forced expulsions have fueled the tensions. With violence on so many fronts still untamed, Israel's Prime Minister said he spoke to the US President and informed him of Israel's planned next steps. Harry Fawcett, Al Jazeera, West Jerusalem.
Gary Pruitt, he's the CEO of the Associated Press news agency. He joins us from their headquarters in New York. Gary Pruitt, welcome to Al Jazeera. A difficult day for your staff in Gaza. Can you just share with us your thoughts at this time?
Yes, we were shocked this morning to get news that our building was being targeted. We had a short warning. We were able to get our folks out to avoid loss of life, but then the building was leveled by an Israeli missile.
An organization such as yours, Mr. Pruitt, I'm sure you do safety training, quasi-military training to make sure that your staff, when they're in a dangerous situation, know how to react to that. The central accusation from the Israeli army, I have to ask you this point, Mr. Pruitt, the central accusation from the Israeli army is that either in that building or very, very close to that building, there were Hamas assets. What do you say to that?
We've heard that from the Israelis. I can tell you that we've been in that building for about 15 years with our bureau. We certainly had no sense that Hamas was there. We would like to see the evidence. We're not sure whether Hamas was there or not. We don't know. But I can tell you the impact will be that the world will know less about what's going on in Gaza because that building was leveled. It had great sight lines to show the world what was going on in Gaza, and that will be lost. Our brave staff was able to get out in time and to salvage most of our equipment. So AP will continue to report the story. It will impair our ability, but we will continue to report to the world what is happening in Gaza. We had 12 journalists in that building, but all got out safely.
Can I just ask you the same question that I asked a media watcher in our NewsHour program a couple of hours ago, Mr. Pruitt? Does this represent something of, I guess, a point of no return, a Rubicon, if you will, for the Israeli military? And it's kind of, the optics maybe smack of desperation, perhaps, because if you want to stop the message getting out, you destroy literally the equipment that the messengers, the journalists, would use.
Yes, we're the Associated Press and we deal in facts. So I can't speculate as to what the motivation was, but I can tell you the impact will be to reduce the flow of information coming from Gaza. We'll continue to tell the story, but this hurts our ability to do it.
Are your staff regrouping and rebuilding and beginning to do their jobs already?
They are. They were able to get out to safety. They were able to get most of the equipment, armored cars, video cameras, etc. They went home. Is any place safe right now in Gaza? But as safe as they can be, and they're continuing to report the story. But it was a shocking development, and we are we're learning as much as we can from the Israeli government. We've engaged with the U.S. State Department. Most importantly, we're keeping our staff safe, and we're continuing to report this story for the world.
Gary Pruitt, CEO of the Associated Press, thank you very much.
Another restless night as rockets launch from Gaza and air raid sirens fill the streets of Tel Aviv. Earlier on Saturday, an Israeli airstrike targeted a residential building housing several international and local media outlets, including the Associated Press and Qatar-backed Al Jazeera. Occupants were given just an hour's warning before the building was leveled. Israel alleged that Islamist militant group Hamas was operating inside the building, but provided no evidence to back up the claim. Elsewhere, a three-story building in a Gaza refugee camp was also hit, killing at least 10 members of the same family, mostly children. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said the offensive on Gaza will continue as long as necessary, but that forces are trying to minimize civilian casualties as much as possible.
אנחנו ממשיכים לפעול במלוא העוצמה. אנחנו מתחילים על ארגוני הטרור מכות מחץ. מי שהצית את האש, חוטף אש.
Operating out of Gaza, Hamas has so far launched over 2,000 rockets into Israeli territory. Israel says over 90% have been intercepted, but on Saturday, a strike outside of Tel Aviv killed one person. In the West Bank, Palestinian protesters faced off with police as they marked the 73rd anniversary of the Nakba, the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that arose from the creation of the State of Israel. Nearly 3/4 of a century on, the world is watching closely. The UN Security Council will discuss the spiraling situation at a meeting on Sunday.
I want to show you a photo, just one, because sometimes one photo is all it takes to get to the heart, as it were, of the issue. Currently, a war is raging in Israel, and here is the photo that tells you everything you need to know about the history and the future of this conflict. This is what is called the Iron Dome at work in the skies above Israel. On the right-hand side of the photo, you can see the deadly rockets being fired out of Gaza in an aggressive and deliberately offensive act of war, designed to kill and maim as many innocent, everyday Israeli citizens as possible. Those rockets, by the way, have been supplied by Iran, funded in part by the Obama-Biden administration, and indeed by countries such as ours via our donations to the United Nations. Now, on the left-hand side of the photo, looking like something out of Star Wars or Close Encounters, you can see the Iron Dome, a technological miracle that allows Israel to shoot those Iranian and Hamas rockets out of the sky in a purely defensive act designed to save citizens' lives. Now, allow that to tug on the logical side of your brain rather than tug at the emotional strings of your heart. On the right-hand side, a barrage of deadly missiles supplied by the terrorist Iranian regime to the murderous thugs of Hamas, designed to kill Jewish men, women and children as they sleep in their beds. On the left-hand side, a highly sophisticated and remarkable defensive system designed through ingenuity and necessity over many long years to protect lives. That is the story of the Gaza conflict and the history of Israel and Palestine. Pretty much everything else you will hear is obfuscation, distortion and lies, including this insidious rubbish that the Palestinians are the victims courtesy of the pernicious moral relativism of the left, peddled incessantly by the mainstream media and spouted by fools such as the creepy former leader of Pink Floyd, Roger Waters.
Unless some pressure is brought to bear upon the Israeli government to stop their ferocious, murderous attack on Gaza.
What rubbish. Of course, this disgraceful performance by Adam Bolton on Sky News in London interviewing the Israeli ambassador, Tzipi Hotovely, takes the
United Nations, its duty to say that Hamas is committing a double war crimes.
Right.
One war crime is they're shooting from civilian areas, and the other one they're shooting to civilians. So they're committing double war crimes.
As you well know, the United Nations has repeatedly said that the settlements are illegal in international law and should cease, and those are continuing.
But they need to condemn terror organization, which is recognized by Britain and by the United States, that is now shooting into civilian
all
population.
I'm saying is it's a bit
and
rich to
killing
say the
people.
United Nations should do something when Israel is ignoring what the United Nations has said in the context of settlements.
Can I ask you something? What would you do if Britain was under a fire? What would you do if London was under fire and rockets were thrown on your house? What would you do? Do you think Britain would have sitting silent, not protecting its citizens? Do you expect any sovereign country not to protect its citizens?
Of course you can protect citizens. The question is the retaliation and the attacking of civilians in Gaza and elsewhere, which, as we know, once again is leading to disproportionate suffering on the Palestinian side.
Disproportionate, settlements. So just to be clear, in the eyes of the woke left, Israel should sit back silently and allow its citizens to be blown to smithereens by rockets and bombs because of complicated historical reasons. There are some disputed Jewish settlements out in Judea and Samaria on land that, by the way, for over 3,500 years has been the home of the Jews. That's your lefty logic. Oh, and if Hamas fires thousands of deadly rockets into the suburbs of Tel Aviv, if imams call for Israeli Muslims to rush out and buy cheap 5-shekel knives to slit the throats of their Jewish neighbours alongside whom they have lived peacefully for decades, as they have done, if synagogues are burnt to the ground, oh, that's all hunky-dory. But it is disproportionate. What a vile word, disproportionate of Israel to defend its people. How dare the Israeli government stop Jews being killed? Well, may Adam Bolton hang his head in shame.
Internationally, there are growing calls for a ceasefire. The US envoy to the region is en route at the moment, and an Egyptian delegation has already arrived today in Tel Aviv. Let's talk more about that Egyptian delegation with our correspondent in Cairo, Edouard Cousin. He's on the line for us now. Edouard, what can you tell us about this Egyptian delegation and what their plans are now they've arrived in the country?
Yeah, well, this morning an Egyptian security delegation first went to Gaza, to the Gaza Strip, to talk with Hamas, and from there they moved to Tel Aviv to talk with an Israeli delegation, and their aim is to broker an immediate ceasefire. They try to convince both sides to cease hostilities. If that will work is another question. But the Egyptian side has, from earlier this week, put efforts in negotiating a truce between both sides. The Foreign Ministry of Egypt, Sameh Shoukry, has called his Israeli counterpart, and he urged him to cease hostilities and to use diplomatic ways to solve the conflict. He's also in touch with the EU delegation in Cairo, and he has been talking with the German Foreign Ministry. So he's putting a lot of efforts in trying to reach both sides and negotiate a ceasefire.
And this isn't the first time, is it, that Egypt have tried to broker a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel?
Yeah, Egypt really likes to roll as a broker between Israel and Palestine. Like always, when the conflict rises, then they step in and they try to bring both sides together. It's a way for Egypt to affirm its role as an still important factor in the region, and also a bit as the leader of the Arab world. The Arab League seats in Cairo, and Egypt sees itself as an important central state in the region. And by negotiating or brokering between Palestine and Israel, they can affirm this role. And they're in a good position as well, because historically they're close to Palestine, and Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, is an ally of Egypt. But especially past 10 years, they have been much more close to Israel as well. They have very good relations with Israel now. They cooperate in the field of energy. So they are in a position they can speak with both sides, and they like to use that.
Edouard Cousin for us there in Cairo. Thank you very much indeed for talking to us about those Egyptian attempts to broker a ceasefire. Well,
a growing rift in the Democratic Party over the U.S. government's unconditional support of Israel. The escalating violence between the Israeli military and Hamas is proving a big foreign policy challenge for the Biden administration. While diplomatic outreach has been ongoing, the administration has been walking a tightrope, offering support for Israel while acknowledging Palestinian hardships.
Israel has a right to defend itself from these rocket attacks. But we are deeply concerned with the loss of life among civilians, especially among children. Palestinians have a right to live in security and to live in peace, just as Israelis do.
But recent polling among Democrats shows growing skepticism about Israeli policies. A Gallup poll in March found that for the first time, a majority of Democrats now want to see the U.S. government apply more pressure on Israel to resolve the conflict with Palestinians. 53% compared to 43% in 2018. And a new crop of younger Democrats in Congress is taking up the charge.
We must condition aid to Israel on compliance with international human rights and end the apartheid. We must, with no hesitation, demand that our country recognize the unconditional support of Israel has enabled the erasure of Palestinian life and the denial of the rights of millions of refugees.
Let me be clear. Every single death in this conflict is a tragedy. Every rocket and bomb that targets civilians is a war crime. And instead of condemning blatant crimes against humanity and human rights abuses, many members of Congress have instead fallen back on a blanketed statement defending Israel's airstrikes against civilians under the guise of self-defense.
While the U.S. government has restarted financial aid to the Palestinians, it has yet to reopen the U.S. consulate in Jerusalem, a key campaign promise. Nor has Biden yet appointed an ambassador to Israel.